Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into another juicy topic? Today we're tackling urban transformation. And trust me, it's a lot more than just new skyscrapers and fancy coffee shops popping up downtown. Right, we're talking about those complex changes that reshape a city from the inside out. The people, the costs, the whole vibe.
Exactly. We're using this super interesting paper called Urban Transformation Unveiled to guide our deep dive.
And it gets into the nitty-gritty, like how gentrification, social mixing, and even gated communities all play a part in this evolution.
So think of urban transformation as this constant push and pull, a reshaping of a city's DNA, so to speak. But the real question is, who's benefiting from this transformation and who might be getting left behind in the process?
Yeah, and that's where things get complicated, like, take gentrification, for instance. On the surface, it sounds like a good thing, right? Revitalizing neighborhoods, making them more appealing, but
And this is a big but, it often comes at a cost, especially for the people who've called those neighborhoods home for years, maybe even generations.
exactly. Suddenly, their rent skyrockets, their favorite local spots disappear, and they're priced out of the very place they helped build.
It's like that saying, be careful what you wish for. You want a more vibrant neighborhood, but then it becomes unrecognizable and unaffordable.
And that's where social mixing policies come into play. The idea is to create more diverse, integrated communities, which sounds fantastic in theory.
Right, who wouldn't want that?
But, and this is what our source material digs into, these policies can sometimes backfire, pushing out existing residents in the name of balance or renewal.
It's like, how can I put this? Imagine trying to make a party more inclusive by inviting a bunch of new people, but then subtly changing the music, the food, and the whole vibe. Suddenly, the people who were there at the beginning don't feel welcome anymore. Something's off.
Exactly. And our source uses this really interesting example of schools in Istanbul. The schools located within gated communities often have way more resources than schools in less affluent areas just a few blocks away. So even though the idea might be mixing, the reality on the ground is very different.
It paints a pretty stark picture of inequality, doesn't it? Like two different worlds existing within the same city.
It does, and it highlights how these urban transformations don't impact everyone equally. Some people reap the benefits, while others are left grappling with the consequences.
It's interesting how we often think about gentrification as the main driver of these inequalities, but then you bring up social mixing policies as like, wait a minute, even well-intentioned efforts can have these unintended side effects.
Yeah, and to make it even more complicated, now we're going to throw gated communities into the mix.
Right, because at first glance it seems like gated communities are kind of the opposite of social mixing.
Exactly. But the paper makes this thought-provoking argument. It says that both gated communities and those sometimes not so successful social mixing policies can actually end up having a similar effect. They both contribute to this fragmentation of our cities, just in different ways.
Okay, so I'm imagining like a city splitting apart, not literally, but in terms of who has access to what and who feels welcome where.
Exactly, it's like on one side you have these gated communities that are all about creating the sense of security and exclusivity. But that often comes at the cost of isolation from the rest of the city. And then on the other side you have these social mixing policies that, while they're trying to create more diversity, they can sometimes end up displacing the people who've always lived there.
So it's not just about physical walls then, it's more about these invisible barriers that are being created.
Yeah, economic barriers, social barriers, cultural barriers, you name it. This is where the paper introduces this term that I think is powerful, super-gentrification.
Super-gentrification, okay, so it's like gentrification but with a cape and superpowers. What makes it super?
Right? Well, imagine gentrification but on fast forward and with a much bigger budget. We're talking about this hyper-concentrated form of gentrification where entire neighborhoods are completely transformed at an incredibly rapid pace. It's often driven by global investment in luxury development, and it can change the entire character of a neighborhood in just a few short years.
So it's like instead of just sprucing things up a bit, they're hitting the reset button on the whole neighborhood.
Pretty much. And that's where the so what factor comes in. Because all of this gentrification, social mixing, and gated communities, it's not just some abstract urban planning theory. It has very real consequences for the people who live in these cities.
Exactly, like their ability to afford to live there, their access to good schools, parks, transportation, all of that.
And beyond that, it also affects their sense of community, their sense of belonging.
Yeah, I was reading an article the other day about how mention a specific example of a city experiencing these challenges is struggling with these issues of rapid gentrification, longtime residents being priced out of their homes, local businesses shutting down. It's like this whole ripple effect.
And it's happening everywhere. It makes you wonder, can we create cities that work for everyone? Or are we always going to have this gap between the haves and the have-nots?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because if we don't figure out a way to make our cities more inclusive and equitable, then who are we building them for? It feels like we're trying to solve this puzzle where all the pieces are constantly shifting. How do you make a city better without pushing out the very things that made it special in the first place?
Right. And the paper doesn't just point out the problems, it offers some solutions. One of the big ones is we need to stop thinking just about building more housing in general and start focusing on affordable housing.
Because just adding more luxury apartments isn't going to help the family who's been in that neighborhood for decades, suddenly struggling to afford rent.
Exactly. And it can't just be about developers and city planners making decisions from some high-rise office. The paper emphasizes how important it is to include the community in these decisions.
It makes total sense, right? Like trying to bake a cake but only asking half your friends what kind they like. You might end up with something pretty, but will everyone enjoy it?
And that's what's so often missing from these urban transformations. It's all about who's got the money and the plans, but not about the people who call that place home.
It's like they forgot that a city is about more than just buildings. It's the people, their stories, their lives that make a city what it is.
And that's why I think these conversations are so important. It's not just about understanding the problems. It's about realizing we all have a role to play in shaping our cities.
So to everyone listening, take a look around your city. What's changing, who's benefiting, and who might be getting pushed aside? What could you do to get involved? Even just asking those questions is a good start.
Because at the end of the day, cities are a reflection of us. They show if we can work together, create something new, and build a future everyone can share. What kind of city do we want to create? That's the question.
That's a powerful question. And on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Remember, knowing about these issues is important, but it's what we do with that knowledge that matters.